In the quiet industrial towns of the American Midwest, where steel mills once roared with the promise of lifelong employment, a new silence has fallen. Factories that stood as symbols of prosperity now stand shuttered, their machinery sold off or left to rust. Workers, many in their middle years, find themselves retraining for service jobs that pay a fraction of what they once earned. This scene, repeated across Europe from the auto plants of Germany to the shipyards of Italy, is not the result of some natural economic evolution. It is the direct consequence of a deliberate strategy unfolding thousands of miles away, in the vast manufacturing hubs of China. Today we examine the phenomenon known as the Second China Shock, a wave of cheap exports flooding global markets, reshaping industries, and challenging the very foundations of Western economies. This is not merely a story of trade imbalances. It is a narrative of strategic ambition, economic vulnerability, and the profound shifts that define our interconnected world. To understand the Second China Shock, we must first revisit the first one, an event that economists now recognize as a pivotal turning point in global economic history. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, China underwent a transformation from a centrally planned economy to one increasingly integrated with the global market. This shift culminated in China's accession to the World Trade Organization in 2001, a move that granted it permanent normal trade relations with the United States and other major economies. At the time, this was hailed as a triumph of globalization, a bridge that would bring prosperity to all. China's vast labor force, willing to work for wages far below those in the West, combined with its improving infrastructure and government support, made it an irresistible destination for manufacturing. The First China Shock, as it came to be called in academic circles, refers to the rapid increase in Chinese imports that followed. Between 2000 and 2007, Chinese exports to the United States alone surged by over 300%. These were not high-tech goods but labor-intensive products: textiles, apparel, furniture, and basic electronics. Western consumers benefited from lower prices, clothing became cheaper, household items more affordable, but the cost was borne by workers in import-competing industries. In the United States, research by economists David Otter, David Dorn, and Gordon Hanson estimated that the China shock accounted for about 1/4 of the decline in manufacturing employment during that period, equating to roughly 1 million jobs lost. Entire communities in regions like the Rust Belt saw factories close as companies either relocated to China or succumbed to competition from subsidized imports. This was not just an American story. In Europe, similar patterns emerged. The United Kingdom's textile industry, once a cornerstone of its industrial revolution, withered under the pressure. Germany's Mittelstand, the network of small and medium-sized enterprises, faced challenges in sectors like consumer goods. The shock was uneven, hitting local economies hard while benefiting urban centers and consumers. It exacerbated income inequality, as low-skilled workers bore the brunt, while higher-educated professionals in finance and technology thrived. Politically, it sowed seeds of discontent, contributing to the rise of populism in the 2010s. The First China Shock taught us that globalization, while efficient in theory, could devastate lives and communities in practice if not managed carefully. Yet as the world adjusted to this new reality, China's economy evolved. By the 2010s, it had become the world's second-largest economy, with a middle class burgeoning and domestic consumption rising. Wages in China increased, eroding some of its low-cost advantage. Multinational companies began diversifying supply chains, looking to Vietnam, India, and Mexico. It seemed the era of unchecked Chinese export dominance might be waning. But then, in late 2021, a crisis struck that would set the stage for the Second China Shock. China's real estate sector, which had fueled much of its growth for 2 decades, began to implode. Real estate accounted for nearly 30% of China's GDP, driven by speculative investment and easy credit. Developers like Evergrande borrowed heavily to build vast housing complexes, often in excess of actual demand. When the government, under President Xi Jinping, imposed stricter regulations to curb debt and speculation, the so-called 3 red lines policy, the bubble burst. Property prices plummeted, construction halted, and millions of pre-sold apartments remained unfinished. Local governments, reliant on land sales for revenue, faced fiscal shortfalls. Consumer confidence eroded, leading to a slowdown in domestic spending. By 2023, China's economic growth, once consistently above 6% annually, dipped below 5%, with some quarters showing even weaker performance. Faced with this downturn, Beijing did not pivot to stimulating consumer demand through broad-based reforms. such as strengthening social safety nets or reducing household savings rates. Instead, it doubled down on its industrial policy, channeling vast resources into manufacturing. This was not a haphazard response, but a calculated strategy rooted in China's long-term vision of technological self-sufficiency and global leadership. Programs like Made in China 2025, launched in 2015, had already aimed to dominate key sectors such as electric vehicles, renewable energy, semiconductors, and advanced machinery. Now, with the real estate sector in tatters, subsidies, low-interest loans, and tax incentives flowed even more aggressively into these areas. The result was overcapacity on a massive scale. In electric vehicles, for instance, Chinese production capacity reached over 40 million units per year by 2024, while domestic demand hovered around 10 million. Companies like BYD and SAIC, backed by state support, produced vehicles at costs unattainable elsewhere, thanks to subsidized batteries and supply chains. Similarly, in solar panels, China controlled over 80% of global production, with factories churning out modules far beyond what the world needed. Steel, chemicals, and lithium-ion batteries followed suit. Unable to sell domestically due to weak consumer demand, Chinese firms turned outward, exporting at prices that undercut competitors worldwide. This export surge marked the onset of the second China shock. Unlike the first, which focused on low-value goods, this wave targeted high-tech and strategic industries. Data from 2024 and 2025 illustrates the scale. China's trade surplus in manufactured goods reached a record $1.2 trillion in 2025, equivalent to about 2% of global GDP, twice the level during the first shock. Exports to Europe and the United States grew by double digits, even as tariffs were imposed. In the European Union, imports of Chinese electric vehicles jumped 50% in the first half of 2025, capturing a significant market share from established players like Volkswagen and Stellantis. In the United States, despite tariffs introduced under the Trump administration, Chinese goods rerouted through third countries like Mexico and Vietnam flooded the market. Let us break this down step by step, beginning with the mechanics of overproduction. China's industrial policy involves a web of state-owned banks providing cheap financing to favored sectors. For example, in the battery industry, companies receive grants covering up to 30% of investment costs. This allows them to scale production rapidly, achieving economies of scale that drive down unit prices. When domestic sales falter due to high household savings rates, around 35% of disposable income compared to 5% in the US, and lingering economic uncertainty, excess inventory is exported. Prices are often set below cost, a practice known as dumping, to gain market share. Next, consider the currency factor. The Chinese yuan has depreciated against major currencies in recent years, making exports even cheaper. In 2025, the yuan weakened by about 10% against the dollar, amplifying the price advantage. Combined with subsidies, this creates a double edge. Chinese goods are not only produced cheaply but sold at a discount on the global stage. The impact on Western industries has been swift and severe. In the automotive sector, European manufacturers already transitioning to electric vehicles face existential threats. Germany's auto industry, employing over 800,000 people, reported record losses in 2025 as Chinese EVs, priced 20 to 30% lower, captured consumer interest. Factories in Stuttgart and Wolfsburg scaled back shifts, leading to layoffs. In the US, Ford and General Motors delayed investments in EV plants, citing unfair competition. The solar industry tells a similar tale. US firms like First Solar struggled as Chinese panels, subsidized to the tune of billions, dominated installations. Europe's wind turbine manufacturers, once leaders, saw orders shift to Chinese suppliers offering integrated solutions at half the price. But the destruction extends beyond direct competition. Supply chains have been disrupted. Western companies reliant on Chinese components, such as rare earth minerals for batteries or semiconductors, face volatility as China controls upstream production. This dependency creates vulnerabilities. A single policy change in Beijing can ripple through global markets. Now let us delve into the hidden or less discussed factors fueling the shock. At its core is China's state capitalist model, where the Communist Party directs economic activity toward national goals. Subsidies are not transparent. They often come through local governments or state funds, evading World Trade Organization scrutiny. Estimates suggest China spends over $500 billion annually on industrial subsidy. Dwarfing US and EU efforts. This is not free market competition but a form of economic warfare aimed at achieving dominance in technologies critical for the future, such as clean energy and artificial intelligence. Geopolitics plays a role too. The second China shock coincides with heightened tensions over Taiwan, the South China Sea, and human rights. China's export strategy serves dual purposes: economic relief at home and leverage abroad. By flooding markets, it creates dependencies that can be weaponized. Recall how China restricted rare earth exports to Japan in 2010 amid a territorial dispute. Another underappreciated aspect is environmental and labor standards. Chinese production often bypasses stringent regulations that Western firms must adhere to, lowering costs but at a human and planetary price. Pollution in manufacturing hubs like Guangdong remains high, and labor conditions in factories can be exploitative, with reports of forced overtime and inadequate safety measures. This uneven playing field distorts global trade. Internally, China's overcapacity masks deeper structural issues. High savings rates stem from inadequate social welfare. Without robust pensions or healthcare, households hoard cash. Youth unemployment exceeded 20% in 2025, fueling social unrest. Protests over unfinished apartments and job scarcity have grown, prompting tighter controls. Yet, Beijing prioritizes industrial might over consumer-led growth, fearing that empowering individuals could erode party control. The global implications of the second China shock are profound and multifaceted. Economically, it accelerates deindustrialization in the West. Europe's trade deficit with China ballooned to over €400 billion in 2025, straining budgets and jobs. In the U.S., manufacturing employment, which had stabilized post-2010, began declining again. This fosters inequality. Skilled workers in tech hubs prosper, but those in traditional industries suffer. Socially, it mirrors the first shock's effects: rising discontent, polarization, and support for protectionist policies. The Guardian noted in December 2025 that Europe's timid response risks devastating its industries, echoing calls for bolder action. Beyond the West, emerging markets feel the strain. Countries like Thailand, Cambodia, and Brazil, which absorbed Chinese exports diverted by U.S. tariffs, now face their own industrial hollowing. Cheap Chinese goods undercut local producers, stifling development. Globally, this overcapacity depresses prices, potentially leading to deflationary pressures. Commodity producers suffer as China's slowdown reduces demand for raw materials like iron ore and copper. Politically, the shock reshapes alliances. The U.S. under Trump imposed tariffs up to 100% on Chinese EVs and batteries in 2025, aiming to protect domestic industries. Europe, divided between free trade advocates like Germany and protectionists like France, has lagged, imposing provisional duties but hesitating on permanence. This divergence strains transatlantic ties. Meanwhile, initiatives like the U.S. CHIPS Act and Europe's Green Deal represent counter-strategies, investing billions in domestic production to reduce reliance on China. Environmentally, the flood of cheap green tech accelerates the energy transition, but at a cost. While affordable solar panels aid climate goals, the concentration of production in China risks supply disruptions and ethical concerns over mining practices. As we draw this examination to a close, consider the long-term trajectory. The second China shock is not inevitable destiny but a challenge that demands thoughtful response. For China, sustaining this model risks internal collapse. Debt levels approach 300% of GDP, and over-reliance on exports exposes it to global slowdowns. Reforms toward consumer-driven growth could alleviate pressures, but they require political will that has so far been absent. For the West, passivity is not an option. Tariffs, while blunt, buy time for reshoring and innovation. Industrial policies like the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, which subsidized clean tech to the tune of $369 billion, show promise in rebuilding capabilities. International cooperation through reformed WTO rules or alliances like the G7 could address subsidies fairly. Education and retraining programs must support displaced workers, ensuring transitions are equitable. Ultimately, this shock underscores the fragility of unchecked globalization. A balanced world economy requires reciprocity, open markets paired with fair practices. If addressed wisely, it could usher in a more resilient order where innovation thrives without exploitation. But if ignored, it risks deeper divisions, economic stagnation, and geopolitical instability. The factories may close, but the human spirit endures, provided we act with foresight and resolve. This is the lesson of the second China shock, a chapter in the ongoing story of our global interdependence. As we reflect on the trajectory of this second China shock, it becomes clear that its effects are not confined to economic statistics or corporate balance sheets. They reverberate through societies, altering the fabric of daily life and reshaping political landscapes on a global scale. In Western nations, the influx of subsidized Chinese goods has accelerated a process of deindustrialization that many thought had stabilized after the first shock. Manufacturing hubs in Europe and North America, already strained by automation and offshoring, now confront competition that is not merely price-based but structurally advantaged by state intervention. Factories in sectors like automotive, renewable energy equipment, and advanced machinery have reported declining orders, reduced shifts, and in some cases, permanent closures. Employment in these industries has contracted further, with estimates suggesting hundreds of thousands of jobs at risk across the European Union and the United States in 2025 alone. The human cost is profound. Workers in their prime earning years, often with specialized skills honed over decades, find themselves displaced into lower-wage sectors or reliant on retraining programs that cannot fully compensate for lost income. Communities built around these industries, towns in northern England, the American Midwest, or Germany's industrial heartland, face declining populations, strained public services, and a sense of abandonment. This erosion of the middle class exacerbates social divides, fueling resentment toward globalization and immigration, even as the root cause lies in asymmetric trade practices. Politically, it has bolstered protectionist movements, influencing elections and policy debates from Washington to Brussels. Yet the second China shock extends far beyond the West, affecting developing economies in ways that could hinder their own industrialization. Countries in Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Africa, which had positioned themselves as alternatives to China in global supply chains, now grapple with an influx of cheap Chinese exports diverted by Western tariffs. In Thailand and Indonesia, local manufacturers in textiles, electronics, and steel have closed facilities, leading to layoffs and stalled economic diversification. Mexico, benefiting initially from nearshoring, has seen its automotive parts industry challenged by rerouted Chinese components. This premature deindustrialization threatens to trap these nations in low-value assembly roles, dependent on Chinese upstream supplies while unable to build competitive domestic industries. The environmental dimension adds another layer of complexity. China's dominance in green technologies, solar panels, batteries, and electric vehicles has driven down global prices, accelerating the transition away from fossil fuels. Affordable Chinese solar modules have enabled rapid deployment in emerging markets, contributing to climate goals. However, this comes at the expense of diversified supply chains and ethical production standards. Mining for critical minerals often occurs under lax regulations, and the concentration of manufacturing in China creates vulnerabilities to policy shifts or disruptions. Western efforts to build resilient green industries through subsidies like the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act aim to counter this, but progress has been uneven amid competition from subsidized imports. Geopolitically, the shock amplifies tensions. China's export strategy not only alleviates domestic pressures but enhances its leverage. Dependencies on Chinese goods in strategic sectors from rare earths to telecommunications equipment can be exploited in disputes, as seen in past restrictions on exports to Japan or Australia. In 2025, amid heightened U.S.-China rivalry, tariffs escalated initially under renewed trade actions, reaching peaks that disrupted flows before partial truces and negotiations led to reductions. Europe's response, with countervailing duties on electric vehicles averaging over 20% plus standard tariffs, has slowed but not halted imports, prompting Chinese firms to invest in local production or reroute through third countries. These measures reflect a growing recognition that fair competition requires addressing subsidies, yet coordinated international action remains elusive, fragmented by differing national interests. Within China itself, the reliance on exports masks unresolved structural challenges. The real estate crisis, far from resolved, continues to drag on growth, with investment in the sector declining sharply throughout 2025. Household confidence remains low, perpetuating high savings rates and weak consumption. Youth unemployment, peaking near 19% in mid-2025 before moderating slightly, underscores mismatches between education and job opportunities, with many graduates turning to gig work or delaying entry into the workforce. Deflationary pressures persist, with producer prices negative for extended periods, complicating monetary policy. Beijing's commitment to manufacturing-led growth through vast subsidies estimated in the hundreds of billions annually sustains overcapacity but delays necessary rebalancing toward services and domestic demand. Looking ahead, the path forward demands nuance and resolve from all sides. For Western economies, defensive measures like tariffs provide breathing room, but sustainable competitiveness requires investment in innovation, skills, and infrastructure. Collaborative frameworks, perhaps revitalized multilateral institutions or alliances among like-minded nations, could establish rules on subsidies and overcapacity, ensuring reciprocity without descending into outright decoupling. Emerging markets must navigate carefully, balancing opportunities from Chinese investment with protections for nascent industries. For China, the current model offers short-term relief but courts long-term risks, mounting debt, environmental strain, and potential backlash that isolates it from global markets. A shift toward consumer-led growth, bolstered by social reforms, could unlock domestic potential and ease external frictions. In the end, the second China shock is a testament to the perils of imbalanced interdependence. It reminds us that economic policies, however well-intentioned nationally, ripple outward with unintended consequences. If met with foresight through fair rules, mutual adaptation, and shared prosperity, it could catalyze a more equitable global order. But if allowed to fester, it risks entrenching divisions, stifling innovation, and undermining the cooperative spirit needed for pressing challenges like climate change. The choices made today will echo for generations, determining whether this era marks a destructive clash or a pivot toward balanced progress in an irrevocably connected world. As we examine the most recent developments in this ongoing economic phenomenon, the data from late 2025 paint a picture of remarkable resilience in China's export sector amid mounting global pressures. By November 2025, China's goods trade surplus had surpassed $1 trillion for the first time in recorded history, reaching approximately $1.08 trillion in the first 11 months alone. This figure, driven by a surge in shipments to markets outside the United States, underscores the adaptability of Chinese manufacturers. Exports of electric vehicles, solar panels, batteries, and other high-tech goods continue to grow robustly, even as prices fell due to persistent overcapacity. The full-year surplus is projected to approach or exceed $1.2 trillion, a level unprecedented for any nation and equivalent to roughly 1% of global GDP. This record surplus emerged despite significant trade barriers. In the United States, tariffs on Chinese goods, which had escalated sharply earlier in the year, were partially moderated following high-level negotiations in late 2025. A truce agreement reduced certain punitive duties, contributing to a stabilization in bilateral flows, though Chinese exports to the U.S. remained down nearly 20% year-on-year. Instead, manufacturers redirected output to Europe, Southeast Asia, Latin America, Africa, and Australia, where demand for affordable green technologies and consumer goods proved strong. Shipments to the European Union rose by nearly 15% in some months, while those to ASEAN nations increased by over 8%. This rerouting not only offset losses from the American market but amplified China's global trade dominance, with its share of world-manufactured exports continuing to expand. Within China, however, this export-led strategy highlighted deepening internal imbalances. Economic growth for 2025 is estimated to have reached around 5%, meeting official targets through the contributions of net exports, which accounted for a substantial portion of expansion. Yet domestic demand remained subdued. Retail sales grew sluggishly, and fixed asset investment, particularly in infrastructure and manufacturing, showed signs of deceleration. The real estate sector, the epicenter of structural challenges, exhibited no clear signs of recovery. Investment in property development declined sharply throughout the year, with new construction starts falling nearly 20% in some periods. Unsold inventory accumulated, and home prices in many cities continued to soften, eroding household wealth and confidence. Local governments, deprived of land sale revenues, faced ongoing fiscal strains, limiting their ability to stimulate local economies. Youth unemployment presented another persistent concern. The rate for urban residents aged 16 to 24, excluding students, fluctuated throughout 2025, peaking near 19% in mid-year before moderating slightly toward the end. This reflected mismatches between the skills of university graduates and available opportunities, compounded by cautious hiring in private sectors amid economic uncertainty. Many young people turned to gig work, further education, or delayed workforce entry, contributing to broader social pressures. On the policy front, Beijing maintained its focus on high-tech manufacturing and self-sufficiency, channeling support into strategic industries. Subsidies and incentives sustained production in electric vehicles and renewables, where China retained overwhelming global market shares, over 80% in solar modules and significant leads in batteries. Deflationary trends persisted, with producer prices negative for much of the year and the GDP deflator in decline, signaling excess supply relative to domestic absorption. Monetary easing provided some relief, but fiscal measures remained targeted rather than broadly expansionary, prioritizing stability over aggressive rebalancing toward consumption. Globally, the second China shock manifested differently across regions. In developed economies, particularly Europe, Chinese imports intensified competition in clean energy and automotive sectors. European tariffs on electric vehicles, averaging over 20% plus standard duties, slowed but did not reverse the inflow, prompting discussions on minimum price agreements and local production investments by Chinese firms. Developing nations experienced premature deindustrialization, as cheap imports undercut local manufacturers in textiles, electronics, and steel. Countries like Brazil, Indonesia, and Mexico imposed their own protective measures, reflecting widespread concerns over unfair competition. Geopolitical ramifications grew as well. Dependencies on Chinese supply chains in critical technologies raised security questions, prompting diversification efforts in the West through initiatives like reshoring subsidies. Yet, the affordability of Chinese green goods accelerated global decarbonization, offering a complex trade-off between climate progress and economic sovereignty. As 2025 concludes, the second China shock stands as a defining feature of the global economic landscape. It has demonstrated China's capacity to navigate external constraints through industrial prowess and market diversification, sustaining growth where many predicted stagnation. However, it has also exposed vulnerabilities, an over-reliance on exports that invites protectionism, unresolved domestic distortions from overcapacity and property woes, and social strains from uneven opportunity distribution. Looking forward, sustainable resolution requires mutual adjustments. For China, gradual reforms to boost household consumption through enhanced social safety nets, wage growth, and reduced precautionary savings could alleviate export dependence and internal deflation. Internationally, coordinated approaches to subsidies and trade rules, perhaps through multilateral forums, might foster fairer competition without fragmentation. This episode reminds us that economic interdependence, while a source of efficiency and innovation, carries risks when imbalances persist. Managed wisely, it could evolve into a more equilibrated system benefiting all parties. Left unaddressed, it threatens prolonged friction, inefficient resource allocation, and diminished collective prosperity. The factories of China continue to produce at scale, but the true measure of success lies in whether this output translates into shared, enduring advancement across the world. In this interconnected era, the path chosen now will shape economic relations for decades to come. As we approach the close of 2025, the most recent economic indicators underscore the extraordinary scale and persistence of the second China shock. In the first 11 months of the year, China's merchandise trade surplus reached approximately $1.08 trillion, according to data released by the country's Customs Administration in early December. This figure, achieved despite significant declines in exports to the United States, down nearly 19% over the same period, represents the first time any nation has surpassed the $1 trillion threshold in such a timeframe. November alone contributed a surplus of around $112 billion, one of the highest monthly totals on record. Projections suggest the full-year surplus could approach or exceed $1.2 trillion, highlighting the redirection of Chinese goods to alternative markets and the sheer momentum of its manufacturing output. This surge has been propelled by continued strength in high-value exports, particularly in clean energy technologies. Electric vehicle shipments have remained robust, with China solidifying its position as the world's largest automobile exporter, surpassing Japan and projecting well over 6 million units for the year. Solar panel and battery exports have also contributed significantly, even as global prices for these goods have declined due to abundant supply. The affordability of these products has driven demand in emerging markets across Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Where growth in imports from China has offset losses in more restricted developed economies. Domestically, however, the picture is one of persistent fragility. Official figures indicate real GDP growth of around 5% for the year, supported in large part by net exports, which have accounted for a disproportionate share of expansion amid subdued internal demand. Independent analyses, however, paint a more subdued portrait, estimating actual growth closer to 2.5 to 3%, reflecting ongoing deflationary pressures. The GDP deflator has declined for multiple quarters, and a sharp contraction in fixed asset investment, particularly in real estate and infrastructure. Property development investment has fallen markedly, with unsold inventories persisting and consumer confidence remaining low. Household savings rates continue to hover at elevated levels, constraining retail spending and perpetuating reliance on external markets to absorb production. Youth unemployment, a barometer of structural challenges, has shown some moderation in recent months. The urban rate for those aged 16 to 24, excluding students, eased to 16.9% in November, down from higher peaks earlier in the year. Yet, this improvement masks deeper issues. Many graduates have settled for positions below their qualifications or turned to informal gig work, while overall job creation in high-skilled sectors lags behind the supply of educated entrants into the labor force. On the trade front, tensions have evolved through a series of escalations and partial de-escalations. In the United States, tariffs on Chinese goods, which had peaked at extraordinarily high levels earlier in the year, were moderated following diplomatic engagements, contributing to a fragile truce that has stabilized bilateral flows to some degree. Chinese exports to the U.S. nonetheless remain substantially lower than prior years, prompting further diversification. In Europe, countervailing duties on electric vehicles, averaging over 20% in addition to standard import taxes, have slowed but not reversed inflows. Discussions on alternative mechanisms such as minimum price agreements have resumed, though outcomes remain uncertain. Meanwhile, retaliatory measures have broadened, with China imposing provisional duties on certain European dairy products in late December, citing subsidies, a move widely viewed as linked to the ongoing disputes over clean technology trade. These developments illustrate the adaptive nature of China's export strategy. Faced with barriers in traditional markets, producers have accelerated shipments to regions with fewer restrictions, including substantial increases to Southeast Asia, up over 14% in some periods, Africa nearly 27%, and parts of Latin America. This rerouting has not only sustained the trade surplus but amplified pressures on local industries in those destinations, contributing to concerns of premature deindustrialization in developing economies. The environmental implications remain dual-edged. The proliferation of affordable Chinese green technologies has undeniably supported global efforts to reduce emissions, enabling faster adoption of solar power and electric mobility in price-sensitive markets. Yet, the concentration of production raises questions about supply chain resilience and the long-term sustainability of models reliant on heavy state support. As 2025 draws to an end, the second China shock stands revealed not as a transient imbalance but as a structural feature of the contemporary global economy. It reflects China's unparalleled industrial capacity, forged through decades of investment and policy direction, now channeling excess output outward amid domestic constraints. For recipient nations, it offers short-term benefits in lower prices and access to advanced goods, but at the potential cost of competitive displacement and heightened dependency. The path ahead hinges on deliberate choices. For China, addressing root causes through reforms to bolster social welfare, encourage consumption, and resolve property sector overhangs could gradually reduce export dependence and mitigate internal risks like debt accumulation and deflation. Internationally, unilateral measures provide temporary shields, but multilateral engagement on subsidy disciplines, capacity management, and fair competition offers the prospect of more stable equilibria. In this era of profound interconnection, the second China shock compels a reckoning with the asymmetries of globalization. It challenges assumptions about unfettered markets delivering equitable outcomes and underscores the need for governance frameworks that balance efficiency with resilience and fairness. If navigated with prudence and cooperation, this period of disruption could foster innovations in policy and industry that benefit the broader world. If mishandled, it risks entrenching fragmentation, economic inefficiency, and diminished trust among nations. The legacy of these years will depend on whether leaders rise to the occasion, transforming competitive pressures into catalysts for shared advancement in a multipolar age. The production lines in China's vast factories continue unabated, but the true test lies in ensuring that their output serves not just national imperatives, but the collective progress of humanity.